Good afternoon. It is Monday, May 25th, 2026, and I'm here in Mill Springs National Monument, National Cemetery out with Marco. It's Memorial Day, and so decided to take a drive through the country out to this place to pay my respects to the men and women who gave their life for this country. And also so that I could see a new place here in Kentucky that I've not yet visited, which has been a big impetus for this project and this video series, to give myself a reason to explore, to get out of the house, and to learn about the history of the place that I call home. And so it's a beautiful day out here. It's a warm, quiet day. The National Monument itself is closed for the holiday, but the cemetery, which is just a few yards adjacent to us, is open, and there's quite a few people there. And so I figured that it would be more fitting so as not to interrupt people's maybe quiet and somber reflections to take video here in the park instead. And so you'll see people kind of driving through the park as we walk, but it's much quieter here than it is in the cemetery next door to us. And Mill Springs straddles really three counties: Nancy, Pulaski, and Wayne County, which is a couple hours from Hart County, where we live. And I always prefer to stay off the highways, so it takes a couple hours to get here from the house, but the roads and the land in between is incredibly beautiful. So we had a really nice drive through the country. And Mill Springs is important both for American history as well as for a day like Memorial Day, because it was one of the first significant battles during the Civil War. It was fought during the opening year of the war in 1862. And it represented one of the early and important Union victories. Abraham Lincoln is rumored to have said that, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." I think that's still true today, quite frankly. Kentucky is a special place with really exceptional people, and its location is both strategic and historically important to our nation. And so I feel fortunate to be a resident and a citizen of this state. And a lot of what I've been trying to do in these last few months is to try and find a way to serve my community and to be involved in the lives of those that make this place what it is. And so on Sunday, I was invited by a man that I'd recently met to attend church service at the Munfordville Baptist Church in town near the house. And I mentioned over Easter that the town was in a state of mourning. We had lost one of our own very recently on Good Friday. And it just so happened that a couple of weeks later, as I was walking Marco around the town square, a gentleman stopped me and engaged in conversation, which is not uncommon based on my experience, but It came to pass that he'd found out that I was a member of Hart County Search and Rescue, and he'd asked if I was there on that Good Friday when they recovered the body from the river. And I told him that I'd shown up a couple hours late and they were already bringing the boats in from the river. And so I didn't participate in the recovery itself, but I was there and I was aware of what had happened. And he shared with me that it was his family member that had passed. And I didn't know what to do. So I just hugged him and told him how sorry I was. And like so many people that I've met, he responded with such grace and strength and kindness. And he asked if someday I would like to attend a church service with him and his family. And of course I accepted. And I would have been happy to accept under any circumstance, but especially given what his family had endured and the openness of his invitation, I was more than honored to accept the invitation. And so it just so happened that it was this weekend and I attended, and they were introducing a new pastor who grew up in Hart County and had ministered to a congregation in Elizabethtown, just north of Munfordville. And he was entering into form of retirement and decided to come back home to his home county. And the service had no frame of reference for the type of service in a Baptist church, but it was wonderful. He had both gravitas and lightness and humor to him. And so I was really glad that I could have attended. And in the course of the service, I also met the man's wife, and I shared with her similar losses that I'd experienced, and I believe, and I was happy to know that it gave her some comfort to know that she wasn't alone in her pain. And one of the things that I think about from that experience is that we should all be in some ways grateful for the pain that we carry, and for our ability to carry it, because there's some people in our own lives, let alone the rest of the world, that are carrying much greater pain than we are, and would in some ways happily trade their burden for ours. And in the course of that service, which was a beautiful service filled with laughter and singing and a children's sermon, she had to excuse herself and step out because the emotions were too overwhelming. And yet she did so with such a quietness and dignity, and returned with a form of an apology which was absolutely unnecessary. Everyone, all the congregants, myself included, could understand, but they were both so kind and both so strong and both filled with so much grace despite what they had recently lost. And to think that Their loss happened on Easter weekend, and between then and now, there's been Mother's Day, and today's Memorial Day, and their family member was themselves a veteran. All these points of remembrance for anybody would be overwhelming and almost too much to bear, but it's such a sign of their own character and the resilience of individual people in the company of others, especially in the company of a congregation, that you find ways to marshal the strength and show up both in your private life and in your community, regardless of the loss you may have endured. And so it put a lot of things in my own life in perspective, which was really important for me. You know, I'd experienced a form of loss and losing Matilda. I've been, over the past month, racked, and in some cases and on some days, unable to do much at all. And there's no mandate to compare your pain to that of others, but it is good to be reminded that pain exists along a spectrum, and that what you're carrying, as hard as it might feel to you at the time, is in some ways much less than what others are. And yet they still show up for their lives, for their loved ones, and for their obligations quietly and without seeking any recognition. And because of that, really heroically. And so I felt very humbled by the invitation and the experience, and I wanted to find a way to remember others that lost their lives in service to their families and service to our country on a day like today, by coming out here and just spending some time out in nature, which, as you can see, Marco also enjoys and loves. And the interesting thing about Mill Springs and the site of this cemetery and battlefield is that because it was one of the earliest battles in the Civil War, a lot of the people that are buried in the cemetery were just regular people, farmers and shop owners, and not necessarily professional soldiers. And the whole idea of Memorial Day, the need to pay homage and to honor those that have sacrificed their lives for this country, and to give us an opportunity to enjoy and to capitalize on the freedoms that this country guarantees. We're just regular people called upon, or in some cases maybe even forced to do really extraordinary things. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about the service yesterday was that they spoke so reverently about Memorial Day and those who sacrificed for this country. They didn't gloss it over, they didn't focus on scripture, they attach scripture to the actual activities and sacrifices of ordinary American citizens. And that's a really important thing for me, is that we can have elevated and noble sounding ideologies, but it's the quiet courage, the unsung heroism, and at times the forgotten sacrifices that really provide the greatest gift to our fellow citizens and to this country. I, for one, am so grateful for everything that this country stands for and has meant for me and my family. And I've been in the habit for many years on Memorial Day of visiting cemeteries. Many members of my family served, and I've always been drawn to cemeteries themselves. When I was living in the Bay Area, I was a volunteer docent at this cemetery called Mountain View, which is in Oakland, in the hills in Oakland, overlooking San Francisco Bay and the cities of Oakland and Berkeley. And that cemetery was designed by a man known as the father of landscape architecture in America, Frederick Law Olmsted. And he was doing some work in the western states and had helped define the footprint of Yosemite Valley, but he took a side project to design one of the most beautiful cemeteries that I've ever walked through, called Mountain View. And so I've had a real affinity for these types of places, and this particular cemetery has that same kind of intimacy and modest scale that contrasts really clearly with a place like Arlington, which is almost overwhelming in its display of sacrifice. This place is much more integrated into the landscape and the community, and I think in that way reflects a lot of the daily sacrifice that people actually make for this country, whether they're in the armed forces or farmers or first responders, teachers, or tradespeople. And so, you know, last weekend I spent 4 days training to be a swiftwater rescue technician. And I spent those 4 days working with two firefighting teams from Paris and Paducah, Kentucky. And there are many things that I learned. It was much harder than I anticipated mentally, because there was so many skills that I had very little familiarity with, like rigging ropes and pulley systems, and a lot of the equipment that we ended up training with and drilling with that weekend. But what was true is that there was this clear attitude of self-sacrifice and service that was present in every person that was participating over those 4 days. And it was with Bill Matney, who I trained with before, who was, say it again, just an amazing resource to this entire area. But he and the people there typify what I've come to know about the people in this state, is that they are incredibly skilled and kind and generous with their time when it comes to improving their own abilities in order to help their communities. And one of the things that Bill kept focusing on was the purpose of the training was so that we could learn our own limits, so that we could make individual decisions about whether or not we were well suited to try and help in any particular situation. And that taught me another lesson about not just search and rescue operations, but in life, that in order to be helpful, it's important to build up our own abilities, our own knowledge, so as not to be a liability. And I think that one of the takeaways that I had from that 4-day experience was that whether it's in my personal life or as a volunteer, that I have an obligation to make myself smarter and stronger and wealthier, not just in terms of money, but in terms of my historical understanding, my spiritual orientation, in terms of everything that would make me better able to assess my own ability to be a resource to myself, my family, and others. And so on a day like today, when I think about all the sacrifices that have been made on our behalf as Americans, I also think about what I can do to honor that sacrifice by becoming a better and more capable person. You know, I'll end this talk with an update from my last video about the data center that was proposed for Cave City. The good news is that City Council was able to vote in a 1-year moratorium so that it would give time for the residents to adequately evaluate whether or not a data center in their city, let alone their county, right at the entrance to Mammoth Caves, was something that would benefit the region. But there's a lot of money and interest and influence that are pushing for these changes in rural landscapes like Kentucky. And so that small victory just gives the residents an opportunity to continue the conversation and in some ways continue the fight. And I think about that in context of a day like today, because I sometimes wonder if the ideals that this nation was founded on, that the people that are buried in cemeteries like this all around the country lived and died for, are being upheld by those that we've elected to represent us today. And I don't necessarily believe that our political or business leadership has the regular American citizen's best interest at heart. But what I do know is that there are regular people, regular Kentuckians, regular residents in cities across states around the country that are starting to ask themselves similar questions. And based on the intensity and passion of some of the political or public discourse, I know that many are prepared to fight and sacrifice and do everything that they can to preserve this way of life and others like it. And in my short time here, I know that I'm willing to do everything I can to help in that effort. And if there's anybody out there that feels the same, please reach out. Places like this are both cause for remembrance, but an inspiration and an indication of a way to move forward. Places like this have not lacked for progress. States like Kentucky are not backwards or unsophisticated. The people here have just honored a way of life that many places have disregarded or undervalued. And they've figured out a way to create communities that are more well integrated into the natural world than just about any other place that I've seen, and integrated in a way that benefits both economically elite and successful people as well as ordinary working class people. And I'm fighting to help maintain that. And so in the next few weeks, I'll probably provide updates insofar as I can, but I'm also going to make an effort to visit more of these places. You know, over the past weekend, I visited one of Frederick Law Olmsted's parks here in Kentucky, just south of Louisville, called Iroquois Park. It's part of the series of Olmsted Parks, Olmsted Design Parks, as well as another really beautiful place called the Bernheim Arboretum. But Kentucky has so many places like this that are green and somewhat wild, and yet just miles or minutes from communities that have been working the land or manufacturing products or living modern life in balance. And I want to give more examples of that because I think this is one of these places that can give an example to others of how to modernize and evolve responsibly without losing our connection to our past, our history, our values, and nature. Thank you very much for listening. Happy Memorial Day. I'll talk to you again soon.